So thanks so much. It's just wonderful to be back on the PopTech stage. And let me say two things very quickly. I've actually been in Pittsfield, Massachusetts for 32 years, which goes a long way towards explaining what I want to talk about, which are industrial cities, Rust Belt cities, legacy cities. The other thing I want to say is that my talk is going to intersect with Jason's. We did not plan this, and so my opening slide is not meant as a diss of my friend, but you're going to see we ended up taking very different sorts of road trips. So this summer was the third summer of the pandemic, 2022. And I said to my sweetie, now my wife, we should rent a van and we should go live the Instagram life. We should do the van life thing. We should camp on the beach. It'll be wonderful. And Amy said to me, we live in Western Massachusetts by beautiful mountains and we don't camp. And I said, okay, so what do we do? And she said, well, you know, we do lots of things. We photograph decaying buildings. We eat really weird ethnic food. We look at weird art. These are the sorts of things that we enjoy doing. And so when we decided to go on a road trip, it was obvious where we needed to go. We needed to go to Utica, New York. We needed to go on to Syracuse. We went on to Rochester. We went over to Buffalo. We went on to Detroit, one of the great cities in America. We went on to Cleveland and Toledo, and because we were getting married this fall, we took a romantic detour to Love Canal. And I should say that generally speaking, these are not the sorts of cities that people dream of going to on vacation. Usually these cities are punchlines of a joke. And honestly, in some cases, these are cities that have a really horrible and tragic past associated with them. The Cuyahoga River literally burned. Large chunks of Detroit and Cleveland have burned, often because landlords decided that it would be a much better bet to get the insurance money for the houses there. What these cities have in common is that they had peak populations somewhere around the 1950s, 1960s. These cities peaked in population around the 1950s, the 1960s. They shrank, sometimes remarkably. In the case of Detroit, the population is 1/3 of what it used to be. So these are cities that have had a very, very hard time. And when we were planning this trip, we called it the Rust Belt Ramble, figuring that we were going to go to these rusty old industrial towns. And about halfway through it, we ended up using a different term, which is the term legacy cities. And it's the term that I prefer. And the reason I prefer the term legacy cities is because these cities are actually a gift from America to her grandchildren. It's the buildings, it's the museums, it's the graveyards, it's the parks, it's the architecture. These are utterly remarkable places. And inasmuch as we do have things like a passport to the national parks where you can go around and get stamps for all the different national parks, we actually need one for America's legacy cities. You should be able to get a stamp when you go and see Diego Rivera's Detroit Industry mural at the Detroit Institute of Art. It's one of the world's great works of art. You should be able to get a stamp for George Eastman's home and the home of Kodak cameras and photography as we know it. And you sure as hell should be able to get a stamp for eating beef on weck in Buffalo, New York. But here's the thing, I'm a software developer. I've been developing software since the 1980s. And I also know that legacy systems are something that we inherit that we sometimes don't want. Legacy code is the crufty old code that we have to keep running because it keeps the income tax system going, it keeps the university email system going. No one knows how to maintain it. And legacy cities can feel like that sometimes. Sometimes when you're in Detroit, sometimes when you're in Cleveland, these cities just feel weird. They feel too big. They feel like they've emptied out. They feel like they were designed for a different moment in time. And that's the case. The wicked problem of legacy cities is how do you support the infrastructure that we need to live in a city when it is paid for by 1/3 of the people who it was initially built for? So here's the thing, I don't actually study cities. I am not an urban planning scholar. It is really awkward to stand up here as an academic and talk about something that I don't actually know anything about, but I do study online communities. And one of the things that my lab at UMass has noticed is that when you're looking at online communities, there are values implicit in each of them. The values behind Facebook are that the people that you know online, you should know them offline. Don't have any strangers online. Twitter believes that we're all in the news. We all want to know what happened absolutely up to the moment, up to the second. YouTube believes that we are all influencers. We are all living in reality TV. And in fact, when you look at these legacy cities, they have values associated with them as well. The good life in a city like Hamtramck, part of Detroit, is one in which you have a union job, one person is working, you have a small detached house in a dense neighborhood where you can walk to school, you can walk to stores, you're probably on a streetcar line. And at some point in the 1970s, we gave up on this version of the good life. It had a lot to do with breaking the power of organized labor. It had a lot to do with moving cities from a heavily unionized north into a non-union south. But we ended up in very, very different cities. We ended up in Houston, in Orlando, and in Phoenix. And these cities are really different. These are cities that deny physical reality. The most important thing about them is that they do not snow. But they are also cities that you can only live in with a car and with air conditioning. Here's one of the craziest things. Houston, one of the biggest cities in the United States, is less dense than Detroit, even now that Detroit has lost 2/3 of its population. These are entirely different places, and they are organized to ignore the physical world. The people who stayed in legacy cities are the people who are building them now. Detroit is a black city. It's almost 80% African American. And people are building a new vision of Detroit that is Afrocentric, it is Afrofuturist. It has enormous pride in the cultural creativity of Motown and in the cultural creativity of Black Power. There are amazing recreations of neighborhoods that are blending between future visions of Africa and contemporary visions. Utica, which has become one of my favorite cities on the planet, is a refugee city. Utica is 25% refugee, not 25% immigrant, 25% refugee. This began with Amerasian refugees during the Vietnam War. It took in thousands of Bosnian Muslims. Now it has become the largest Rohingya population in the United States. It has a massive Somali Bantu population. And what that means is that churches are getting converted into mosques. This is a Buddhist temple that I found in someone's backyard on Steuben Street. And you're seeing a city reborn by this population. Utica shrunk radically, and it is growing now for the first time in decades. So I study refugees online as well. When SESTA FOSTA passed in the United States, it drove sex workers offline all over the world. And one of the most amazing communities is a community called Switter, Sex Worker Twitter. It started up in Australia, where sex work was legal. And it became a space designed by sex workers to figure out how to be online and how to be safe. If you study online spaces, studying refugee spaces is really helpful because they are not dictated by market logic. They are dictated by the logic of people who need to live in these communities. And they experiment and they create stuff that is entirely novel. And that's what's happening in legacy cities. We are starting to see things that is entirely novel and entirely original, whether it's something like the American Riad, which is a way of using open space that's being pioneered in Detroit, or whether it is ethnic food malls, which have become very powerful in a city like Buffalo, New York, as a way of exposing people to culture. So here's the thing. A lot of us are going to become refugees. Climate change is real. It's happening. My wife is from Houston. She ended up selling her apartment because the house across the street keeps flooding. many of us are going to find ourselves relocating from the South, the Southeast, from coastal America at some point in the near future. I don't have a real hard time imagining the future of Phoenix. For me, it probably looks a lot like the Salton Sea, that beach paradise in the middle of California, an easy drive from Los Angeles. You know what's going to be a great place to be in about 30 years? The Great Lakes. They've got 21% of the world's fresh water. Not the US fresh water, the world's fresh water. And the land around these cities is going to become more livable and more productive over time. And even beyond that, these cities that we were living in the 1860s through the 1960s, they are configured for the way that we're going to have to live in the future. And they're already growing. They are already filling up with people who are leaving Pakistan and Bangladesh and eventually Ukraine and Russia. And they are coming to a vision of the good life in America that feels very old for us right now, but is actually a vision of what's going to happen in the future. But I would advise you to buy now, because these cities are transforming right now. New York City in the 1970s and 1980s lost its population. Brooklyn and the Bronx were burning. You did not want to live in Lower Manhattan. It is now perhaps the most expensive city in the world. I recommend Utica, and if you're really lucky, you might be able to find a Rohingya landlord who might be willing to rent to you. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Yeah?
Quickly, first. How did you and your partner decide where to go? So you're sitting there and you say, Attica on the map. How do you actually choose a place?
No, I mean, literally, she said, you're nuts. I don't camp. It's grounds for divorce. And you don't camp. Like, what the hell are you talking about? I mean, you live on the slopes of Mount Greylock. The last time I saw you sleep outside was like 10 years ago. What are you thinking about? And so I lay awake at night and I thought about what we do. And basically, we go to art galleries and we eat cheap food. And it was obvious Utica was the right place to go.
Okay, so you make a good case for a number of places. Was there a place you disappointed with? You said, oh my God, I went all the way and it's just a terrible place.
Some of these towns are tougher than others. Toledo is still a tough city to love. It has not perhaps turned the corner in some of the ways you hope. Syracuse has some really serious challenges based on ethnic division that's actually been built into the highway system. Black and white Syracuse are separated by a highway. But the interesting thing about doing a trip like this is you can see who's done it better. So the city that I really think everyone should move to is Rochester. And Rochester has recently pulled out that interstate and rebuilt it. And it's just gorgeous. It's just a beautiful and incredibly livable city.
And Jason before spoke about incidents he had where he kind of confronted different values or had people. Did you have the same experience? Did you met people that you said it's going to be hard?
I mostly had amazing experiences. So Utica is about 2 hours from where I live, and I go back and forth often because I'm really trying to understand it well. And I was there a couple of Sundays ago, and I was knocking on the door of a Rohingya grocery store, and an African-American man about my age came over and said, no, man, those are good church people. They're not going to be here on a Sunday. And I said, oh, have you eaten here? And he said, oh, yeah, man, do you eat pork? I said, yeah, I eat pork. He said, you got to have their pork burrito. I get like 3 for $10. It's the best food I've ever had. You come back here, you tell them that their black neighbors are sending business to the Burmese grocery store. So there are really interesting things that happen in cities when they realize that immigrant populations, that refugee populations are their future and that that's how they're going to be rebuilt going forward.
Last question. Can you make a case for Pittsfield, Massachusetts? So we're going to all come and visit you.
Pittsfield's super easy to make a case for. Pittsfield doesn't technically qualify as a legacy city because we fell below 50,000. So we were at 65,000. Legacy cities are cities with more than 50,000 people that have lost 25% of their population. We lost 25% of our population. We are below 50,000. But we are in the middle of some of the most fertile arts climate in the world. We have theater festivals, dance festivals, the best contemporary art museum in the world, possibly. And it's dirt cheap. And that's the thing about these cities. These cities are welcoming people because they need people to love them. And I want you to love them too.
What's your address? Thank you, Ethan.
Thanks very much.
Okay.